In this short presentation, we'll be discussing a project that focuses on using probabilistic generative modeling to capture distributions over the kinds of diverse, multi-object task environments that are typical in robot manipulation tasks. At a high level, our model captures the hierarchical structure present in a small dataset of observed scenes by tuning the probabilities and control variables of a scene grammar. The scenes we show here were sampled from our trained model, with trees overlaid to indicate how they were generated by the grammar. The core tool we'll be using for learning scene distributions is a scene grammar, which breaks down scenes into symbols, where symbols can represent either concrete objects like dishes on a table, or abstract groups of objects like the cluster of dishware forming one person's place setting. The grammar provides a set of production rules that are used to generate scenes. Starting from a root node, maybe representing an entire table, rules tell you how to generate intermediate symbols, like each person's place setting, and how to eventually convert those into concrete objects. By carefully constructing the set of generative rules, we can capture a huge variety of scene structures. And finally, by parameterizing the rules, we'll show that we can tune the grammar to match the distribution of an observed dataset of scenes. This kind of data-driven environment modeling is a really important endeavor. We can make complex robots do really hard tasks, but how do we prove that they're going to be reliable in the open world? Understanding the distribution of environments they're going to face is key to answering that question. When you run a set of simulations, your environment model is what tells you how representative of reality those tests were, and can give you a quantitative way to translate sim performance into expected real performance. And at runtime, you can check new environments against your model to detect outliers and preempt problems. Unfortunately, after saying all this, actually learning distributions of multi-object, complex environments is pretty hard, and isn't easy to solve with standard distribution learning strategies. So we're going to push on that part for this project. In robotics, the notion of learning distributions over environments has been getting more interest over the last few years, generally motivated by improving sim-to-real performance transfer. Using scene grammars and trees to supply the structure in these models isn't a new idea either. It was pioneered in computer vision and graphics, and has been a good tool for doing content generation in a data-driven but still transparent and controllable way. We're inspired by this work to apply these tools to robotics-relevant scenes of objects. The core structure we use is a scene grammar, which is defined over symbols V that have attributes. Terminal symbols, shown in red, correspond to actual observed objects, while non-terminal symbols correspond to intermediate structures, like groups of objects. There's always a single root symbol at the root of the tree. Rules describe how to expand a non-terminal symbol into a group of other symbols. Rules describe how the elements of the scene are grouped together, and allow you to start with just a root node and expand out all the different possible scenes. Finally, symbols have attributes. Some are different for every instance, like pose, while some are shared across the entire class of symbols. To actually use a scene grammar to generate scenes, we use code that looks approximately like this. First, we sample each node class's global attributes from a simple generative distribution. For dishes, this could mean we decide at the start how messily each utensil type will be placed overall. Then, we take an unexpanded non-terminal node, starting at the root, and look at all the legal ways it can be expanded, and pick some subset of them based on a categorical distribution over all the possible combinations of rules. Then, for each active rule, we use it to generate a new child node, sampling the child's local attributes conditional on its parent. This conditional relationship is necessary to capture things like the distribution over relative pose, because the distribution over the pose of the child node is often most easily expressed in the frame of its parent node. So, given this complete process, we can sample trees given a grammar. And while running this process forward, we can score the likelihood of the entire tree by looking at each of these probabilities and multiplying them together. To make things more concrete, the grammar for generating table settings looks something like this. We use the table as the root node, and the table can choose to produce a place setting at each cardinal direction independently. Each place setting can choose to spawn any combination of left and right utensils, a cup, and a plate, where each combination has a different probability of happening. Every node has a pose, with the pose of a child node being normally distributed at some position in the parent frame, where the offset is a latent variable shared across the class. We can tune priors of these offset variables, as well as the values of the parameters in the Bernoulli and categorical distributions, to influence, for example, where utensils are placed relative to the plate, or how often certain sets of utensils co-occur. One feature of note here is that we're intentionally using simple normal distributions over the relative pose parameters, and capturing the multimodality through the grammar itself, by distinguishing between the left and right utensils, or the 4 distinct possible place settings. This lets the engineer deal with the hard multimodality problem when they have the right prior knowledge, making the automated inference much more likely to succeed. To analyze an observed scene using the generative model I just described, we need a way to guess the complete scene tree. Parsing, in the formal grammar sense, allows us to do that by attempting to reconstruct the scene tree from just the observed nodes. The full space of possible scene trees is painfully large, so we use a combination of exhaustive expansion of the intermediate nodes with greedy bottom-up parsing. Our procedure, shown in the steps at the bottom, is essentially to pick random unexplained nodes and connect or create nodes that reasonably explain them. Once a complete but maybe suboptimal tree is assembled, we can do further continuous refinement with gradient-based methods. In practice, this technique worked well for us on our examples. Shown here are some parses of place setting observations. Occasionally the method makes mistakes, like associating cups with the wrong place setting, but that's sort of expected. Our method aims to sample from the posterior over parsed trees given the observation, and if the observation itself is ambiguous, as cups in the center of the table sometimes are, it's reasonable to sample different explanations for who that cup belongs to. But generally, this parsing procedure uncovers reasonable trees. Now that we have parsing, we can tackle the big problem we care about, using our grammar to capture the distribution over an observed dataset of environments. Given a set of observations, where each observation is a scene with just the terminal nodes observed, we want to find the parameters of our grammar that maximizes the log evidence. Our parsing procedure gives us a way to approximately sample from the posterior over latent variables, which we're notating here as sampling from some distribution q of t over full parsed trees t. This posterior sampling procedure has its own parameters gamma. We plug this approximation of the posterior into the standard variational inference machinery, the elbow, which lower bounds the log evidence. How this equation is practically optimized is that, starting from the outside, we take a batch of the observations. For each observation, we sample some parsed trees. And for each sampled parse tree, we calculate its contribution to the expectation by scoring the complete scene tree using the grammar, and then we adjust for the density assigned to the particular parse tree by the parsing procedure. This was a whirlwind overview of our variational inference approach, so please refer to our paper and its references for a more thorough treatment and deeper dive. The core takeaway is this: we can take mini batches of scenes, parse out the scene trees for each example, and fit the scene grammar parameters to those fully expanded trees. To demonstrate that this strategy works, here are some illustrations of distributions over place settings. Each of these illustrations shows many overlaid place settings to give you a sense of the clustering of the objects. On the left, we show the target distribution. We produce this by setting the parameters of the place setting scene grammar to known reasonable values and generating 200 samples. We took our model and randomized the parameters to make an untrained version, which, as you can see in the upper right, doesn't produce terribly convincing place settings. After conditioning on the observed dataset, we can recover the target distribution. Here we're showing a representative quantitative result, showing how two sets of latent variables converge over training. These variables control the mean and variance of utensil placement in the x direction in the frame of reference of a place setting. The dashed red horizontal line shows the ground truth value used to generate the training set. At the beginning of training, the value for the parameter is drawn from its prior, but over time it converges consistently to the ground truth value, indicating that the model is reliably uncovering the true distribution of the dataset. We tried this on a 3D example too. We used the placement of mugs onto a rack, using a small dataset of human-generated examples. And we put together another simple grammar that essentially described that mugs could appear on one of the three racks, and then in either upright, upside down, or random orientations. This was to capture the multimodality we expected in this data. Our model is able to learn the distribution of human-generated mugs, and reproduce relatively reasonable arrangements of mugs on the rack, progressing from weak distributions with poor clustering, shown at the top, to tightly clustered arrangements of reasonable numbers of mugs, shown at the bottom. However, a limitation of our method becomes pretty obvious in 3D. Capturing physical feasibility is really hard in a context-free grammar, since non-penetration and static stability are constraints between all pairs of objects. We patch this issue by introducing a projection method for post-processing our generated examples, which tries to transform the generated example into the closest feasible scene, by optimization followed by some forward simulation. This method isn't perfect, and it can mutate the output distribution, making this a ripe area for future work. Finally, we'd like to highlight a particular example use of this system in identifying outliers. When a scene is parsed, it produces an overall score, making it possible to tell if the scene is unusual with respect to the input dataset. But it also produces per symbol scores, making it possible to identify parts of the scene that are outliers and why. Here we show scores for each mug in a rack. It's clear to the model that the adversarially stacked mug on the top is unusual because it's too high off the rack. To recap, we use a parameterized scene grammar as a structure to learn distributions over scenes of objects from data. We presented a parsing procedure for explaining observations using the grammar and built it up into a variational inference algorithm to tune a grammar to data. We can use this tuned grammar to generate new scenes or to explain and score novel observed scenes, including detecting outliers. For more details, please see our paper. Thank you for your attention.